The stage is empty except for one woman and her piano. A single spotlight slices through the dark, landing right on her silhouette. She sits there, still as ever, hands resting on the ivory keys, her face half hidden behind a soft curtain of chestnut brown hair. The audience is dead quiet, not because they don't care, but because they're holding their breath, no joke. Her voice starts low, soulful, worn around the edges. A voice carrying the echoes of outlaw ballads, the hush of a church choir, and the heartbreak of a woman who loved a legend way too deeply. She is Jessi Colter. To some, she's the only rose among thorns in the outlaw country movement. To others, just the wife of Waylon Jennings. But tonight, there's no Waylon, no Mrs. Jennings. Just Jessi, and the music that survived what almost wrecked her. This isn't a comeback. This isn't some tribute gig. This is a reckoning. A woman taking her voice back after decades of standing behind one of the loudest legends country music ever created. Behind the stage lights and rhinestones stood a woman who gave up her own identity for love, for loyalty, for survival. For years, she stayed silent, while Waylon spiraled through addiction, while critics brushed off her success like it was just a bonus perk of marriage, while her own light faded under his storm. But now she sings again. And these notes? They're not just melodies, they're straight-up confessions. Because this is the untold story of Jessi Colter. Not the outlaw's muse. Not the soft harmony in a duet. But the fire in the shadows, the strength and surrender, the woman bold enough to stay quiet in a world obsessed with noise. And once you hear her song, you'll wonder why it took the world so damn long to listen. Before she was Jessi Colter, she was Miriam Johnson, a preacher's daughter born in Phoenix, Arizona in 1943. The desert heat toughened her skin. The gospel shaped her soul. Her mother was a Pentecostal minister, rare and powerful in a man's church. She preached with fire, conviction, and a voice that could shake the rafters. Every Sunday, little Miriam sat front pew, watching her mother call down the Spirit, learning that words, when backed by belief, could move mountains. Her home ran on strict values and clear lines, good and evil, salvation and sin. No gray areas, no room for rebellion. But Miriam, quiet as she seemed, was always pulled toward the in-between. She loved music not just for how pretty it sounded, but for the feelings it stirred, the ache, the longing, the what-if. By 11, she was playing piano in church. By 14, she was writing her own songs. And by 17, she knew the church walls couldn't hold what she needed to say. Still, she didn't rebel with drugs or chaos. Nah, that wasn't her style. She rebelled by choosing country music, a genre her deeply religious family saw as worldly, maybe even sinful. But country had something sermons didn't: storytelling, heartbreak, raw honesty. To her, that felt more sacred than anything. In the early 1960s, Miriam met guitarist Duane Eddy, a rising instrumental rock star. Their connection was quick, electric. He saw what others missed: depth, spark, a voice itching to break free. They married in 1962, and for a while, she became Mrs. Eddy, trailing him from studio to studio, tour to tour. Duane pushed her to record, to write seriously, to step out a little. But even then, she stayed the quiet force behind the curtain. Backup vocals, songwriting. Her name still an afterthought. In 1970, that marriage ended, and so did the identity of being someone else's wife. For the first time, she stood alone. Not Miriam Johnson, not Duane Eddy's partner. She needed a new name, a new sound, something honoring her past but belonging only to her. She chose Jessi Colter, inspired by a distant ancestor, a Confederate rebel. Not for heritage, but for spirit. A woman defying expectations. A woman refusing to be defined by the men she loved. But Nashville, then outlaw country, wasn't exactly soft. It was sharp edges, wild nights, loud voices. Women, if heard at all, were expected to sing about men, not beside them, and definitely not above them. Still, Jessi Colter didn't come to fit in. She came to carve her own lane. Her upbringing gave her discipline. Her heartbreak gave her soul. Somewhere between the two, a sound formed, distinct, feminine, powerful. She didn't know it yet, but her next chapter wouldn't start in church or studio. It would start in a neon-lit bar, staring into the wild eyes of a man named Waylon Jennings. That's a whole vibe right there. She met him in a blur of leather, smoke, and sound. Waylon Jennings, tall, magnetic, unpredictable. A man who didn't just enter rooms, he hijacked them. And Jessi Colter, still finding herself, stood near the fire and walked straight in. They met in 1969. She was fresh out of her first marriage. He was newly divorced for the third time. Both bruised by love. Both searching for something real. Their connection wasn't gentle. It was loud, raw, electric. Waylon was rebellion personified, the face of a movement pushing back against Nashville's polished machine. He didn't want rules. Didn't want scripts. Didn't want to show up sober if he didn't feel like it. He lived like he was outrunning demons every day. And Jessi? She was the calm inside that chaos. But don't get it twisted. She wasn't passive. She was fire under silk, steel under softness. Waylon even said, "She was the only woman who could make me think I was wrong." That's saying something. They married in 1969, merging two forces, one chaotic and loud, one steady and unshakable. Jessi had written for others, sung backup, stayed low-key. Now one nudged her forward. In 1975, the world finally heard her. Not as someone's wife. As herself. The song was "I'm Not Lisa." Haunting. Bare. Heartbreaking. A woman stuck in a lover's memory of someone else. Way too close to home. It hit #1 on the country charts, crossed into the Billboard Hot 100, and suddenly Jessi Colter wasn't background noise. She was the headline. Critics called her the first lady of outlaw country. Not just because of Waylon, but because she held her own in a boys' club full of hard-living men. She toured. She recorded. She wrote with clarity and emotional depth nobody saw coming. In 1976, she joined Waylon, Willie Nelson, and Tom Paul Glazer on Wanted. The Outlaws, the first country album ever to go platinum. Her voice wasn't decoration. It was the aching thread stitching the rebellion together. But success didn't erase the shadows. Waylon's world was drugs, late nights, missed shows, emotional chaos. She once said loving him was like trying to hold smoke in your hands. Still, she stayed. Not because she was weak. Because she believed in him. When he crashed, she picked him up, again and again. They had a son, Shooter Jennings, in 1979. For a moment, they were a mythic music family. But fame is fragile, and love stretched over addiction and ego starts to fray. Jessi had to choose constantly, tour or home, spotlight or family, artist or caretaker. She tried to choose both, and slowly faded behind the legend she helped prop up. But before she faded, there was a golden stretch where Jessi Colter wasn't just part of the outlaw story. She was the story. Rebellion sounding like prayer. Strength without shouting. She had arrived, and the world actually listened. From dusty jukeboxes to late-night radio to sold-out venues, her voice was everywhere. "I'm Not Lisa" broke rules. It wasn't just a hit. It was a statement, a confession drifting through a country lullaby, cutting through the loud outlaw anthems. She followed with What's Happened to Blue Eyes and the album I'm Jessi Colter, proving she wasn't some one-hit wonder. She built her own emotional world, brick by brick. Women especially heard themselves in her trembling notes. Critics admired her restraint. She didn't belt like Tammy Wynette. Didn't sparkle like Dolly Parton. She just ached, quietly and devastatingly. And that hit different. She toured with the men who defined outlaw country, Willie Nelson, Tom Paul Glazer, Chris Christopherson. And at the center, Waylon and Jessi, the outlaw king and his queen. They were country royalty, photographed, adored, mythologized. Interviews, stages, magazine spreads, the rebel love story everybody bought into. But behind the shine, something lingered. Jessi Colter was rarely allowed to stand alone. Even with platinum records and chart toppers, she was introduced as Waylon Jennings' wife. His partner. His muse. His miracle. Rarely just herself. Privately, things got heavier. Once addiction deepened. He was gone a lot. High often. Emotionally volatile. Jessi, grounded in faith, believed in holding on, praying through, loving past the breaking point. She kept writing. Kept recording. But as his fame darkened, hers dimmed beside it. The irony stung. The more iconic they became together, the more invisible she felt. On stage, magic. Off stage, tears. Yet she endured, not from weakness, but conviction. She had left fame once. She could again. But this time she stayed. Through the late 70s, she released albums. Miriam. That's the way a cowboy rocks and rolls. Diamond in the Rough. Honest. reflective, soft but bold. Critics respected them. Sales didn't explode. They were too layered, too emotional, too feminine for a genre still obsessed with outlaws and guns. The world wanted noise again. Jessi wasn't noise. In 1981, she released Leather and Lace with Juan. Marketed as a romantic reunion, a storybook love letter wrapped in song. But behind the lyrics was straight-up exhaustion. Behind the harmonies, a woman tired of always harmonizing, tired for real. And yet she smiled. She sang. She stood beside him because that's what she had always done, no matter what. And at the peak of her fame, she quietly started to pull back. But here's the truth hardly anyone had the guts to say. Jessi Colter had already proven herself. Not through rebellion or sales or spectacle, nah, but by carving out a space where femininity didn't have to scream to be strong. Her success wasn't loud. It was still, deep, unshakable. The kind that lived on, not in charts, but in hearts. She had reached the top. But the price of the summit was silence, and slowly, deliberately, Jessi chose to fade away. At first, it was manageable. The missed shows, the mood swings, the long silences. But as the 1980s crept in, Waylon Jennings, her partner, her legend, her burden, started unraveling. The drugs weren't recreational anymore. They were routine. Cocaine by the ounce, pills by the fistful, money pouring out of their accounts like water through a busted dam. One once admitted to spending $1,500 a day on cocaine at the peak of his addiction. And Jessi, she stayed, not because she was blind, but because she still believed love meant sacrifice. Because she still prayed at night, still whispered hope into a man who didn't believe in anything anymore. The public never saw the nights she sat by the door waiting, didn't hear the fights behind studio walls, didn't see her at the piano alone, writing lullabies to a silence that just kept getting louder. In 1979, their son Shooter Jennings was born, a bright, wide-eyed boy with music in his veins and chaos in his home. Jessi tried to be everything at once. Mother, artist, wife, anchor, ghost. She stopped touring, not because she couldn't sell tickets, but because she didn't even know who she was on stage anymore. She dropped a few albums, but the fire had dimmed. She watched her own name slip from headlines, replaced by Juan's spirals and rehab stints. And still, in every interview, she smiled. She protected him. She dodged the questions. She turned her pain into devotion. But inside, she was fading. There were moments she almost left. Moments when the pain turned physical, panic attacks, sleepless nights, bone-deep exhaustion. But every time she packed a bag, something stopped her. A lyric, a memory, a promise she once made in a church under God and light. In 1984, Waylon was arrested for cocaine possession. The scandal blew up in headlines. And Jessi, she stood by him, not out of duty, but because she was the only one left who believed he could come back. That same year, she released Rock and Roll Lullaby, a haunting record of lost love and blurred identity. It barely charted. The world had moved on, and Jessi Colter had become a ghost in her own story. Years rolled by. She turned down offers, let tour dates slip through her fingers. She focused on raising Shooter, shielding him from the noise, even as it seeped through the walls. People started asking whatever happened to Jessi Colter. They had no idea she was still there, just quieter. They didn't know silence was a language she spoke fluently. While others screamed their pain, Jessi wore hers like a second skin. By the 1990s, Waylon began his slow crawl back to sobriety, and somehow Jessi was still there. The one constant in a life full of collapse. But don't get it twisted, she paid for it. Her career stalled. Her identity blurred. Her voice, once so distinct, became a memory buried under someone else's myth. She gave everything, and in return got written out of the story she helped build. There were no tabloids screaming about her breakdown, no flashy headlines dramatizing her fall, because Jessi Colter didn't collapse in public. She collapsed in private, behind stage curtains, behind prayers, behind the outlaw queen myth. But even at her lowest, she never shattered. Because deep under the silence, there was still a song. And one day, it would rise again. By the late 1990s, the outlaw myth had faded. Waylon Jennings, once the loudest man in country music, was a shadow of himself, frail, tired, hooked up to oxygen tanks and hospital beds. And Jessi Colter, she was still there, the quiet sentinel, the woman who never walked away. She had sacrificed her own voice for decades, for love, for loyalty, for survival. But even the most patient ghosts eventually want to be seen. In 2002, Juan died. At 64 years old, the man who had lived louder than most men ever dared slipped away in silence. And Jessi, after 3 decades beside him, was alone. The headlines read, "Outlaw Country Legend Dies." They listed his albums, his hits, his addictions. Some mentioned Jessi, briefly, as his longtime wife, his musical partner, his support. No one asked, what happens to the woman who gave her life to someone else's legacy? For a while, Jessi disappeared completely. Grief does that. It doesn't just silence you. It uproots you. She retreated to Arizona, the desert of her youth, surrounded by cacti and ghosts. But something shifted. In the stillness of widowhood, Jessi felt something she hadn't felt in decades. Space. And into that space, music started coming back. Not as obligation, not as duty, but as a whisper from the soul she'd hidden way too long. In 2006, for years after Juan's death, Jessi Colter released Out of the Ashes, her first solo album in more than 2 decades. The title wasn't poetic. It was literal. This wasn't some cute comeback. It was a resurrection. Produced by Don Wiss, the album was raw, spiritual, stripped to the bone. Gone were the rhinestones and radio gloss. In their place were hymns of heartbreak, reflections on pain, and a voice older, rougher, but deeper than ever. She sang about loss, about the weight of being forgotten, about forgiveness, not just for Juan, but for herself. Tracks like You Can Pick Them, Please Carry Me Home, and the heart-stopping Velvet and Steel showed a woman finally speaking for herself. Critics were stunned. The Los Angeles Times called it one of the most honest country albums in years. Rolling Stone said it was a confessional wrapped in gospel. And for the first time, truly, the world listened to Jessi Colter without her last name feeling like a footnote. She performed again. Rarely. Carefully. She smiled, but not out of duty. She spoke, but not to defend someone else's name. She wasn't the outlaw's wife anymore. Not just the harmony behind the lead. She was Jessi Colter, artist, widow, survivor, mother. Her son, Shooter Jennings, had carved his own lane in the alt-country world. In interviews, he spoke of his mother not with soft nostalgia, but with awe. She held everything together, he said. She's the reason anything lasted. As the years passed, Jessi didn't chase relevance. Didn't rebrand. Didn't modernize her sound just to fit in. She stayed rooted in who she was, an old soul who had lived a quiet epic, a woman written out who came back holding her own pen. In 2017, she released a gospel album, The Psalms, drawn from ancient scriptures and her own reflections. It was sparse, spiritual, uncommercial, and beautiful. Not made for charts. Made for peace. Because for Jessi Colter, music was never about fame. It was about truth. And her truth was finally, undeniably, hers. When country music tells the story of its wildest years, names like Juan, Willie, and Cash roll off the tongue. Their legends are loud. Their scandals even louder. But tucked in the margins of that mythology is a softer echo. The sound of a woman who survived it all without ever demanding the spotlight. Jessi Colter's legacy doesn't shout. It whispers into the hearts of women who stood behind storms and found ways to endure. Into the hands of songwriters who learned that vulnerability isn't weakness, it's strength in its rawest form. She didn't burn bridges. She lit candles. She didn't rebel just to make noise. She stayed when it was hardest and left only when it was right. She didn't chase fame. She waited for truth. Her voice lives on in rare places. Not in charts, but in quiet reverence. Not in scandals, but in survival. Not in being the loudest in the room, but in being the one who listened the longest, loved the hardest, and sang anyway. Shooter carries the bloodline forward. His music, a mix of both parents. Wants fire. Jessi's soul. But Jessi Colter never needed a monument. She built her legacy in the silence between verses. So we ask, in a world that only remembers the legends who broke things, will we ever learn to remember the ones who held everything together? Will we ever honor the voices that chose grace over glory? Or will Jessi Colter forever remain what she always was, the quiet truth behind the myth?